Yeah, so my book is set in 1992, which in my mind is like yesterday. But I read a review somewhere, I think it was by a YA reader, who said, well, I guess this could be considered historical fiction. And I thought, oh no, 1992, I guess it's 30 years ago, or almost 30 years ago. Um, for me, I said it in 1992 because that's a time that I could kind of really easily identify with, just in terms of sort of capturing that time and place. And I was also looking at the pre-internet age too. I remember in 1992, like the internet was kind of there, but it wasn't really sort of something that had sort of formed, or nobody quite knew what to do with it. So I also kind of like that idea of the main character kind of having really the sense of isolation, that there's no sort of online digital resources to her available. But I think, if anything, I hope what maybe younger queer readers might take away is the way that they are able to connect with one another now in so many more ways. And not to say that you couldn't connect with other people in 1992, but I think it was a little bit more challenging, and there certainly was a lot less support that was visible. Like there was no sort of online forums, there was no kind of like place that you could go in sort of the digital world where you could sort of find yourself, right? I would find myself through books maybe, or through music, or through films, but even then it was pretty hard to come by. So if anything, I hope that maybe today's youth who are reading it understand that while there are so many challenges, obviously, that there are resources that are available in that sort of digital world that didn't exist before.
Yeah, so my book takes place in a similar era. It takes place in 1989 and 1990. I was also shocked when my book was marketed as historical fiction because, I think for those of us writing about growing up in that time period, we are doing it because we grew up in that time period and our youth does not feel historical to us. It feels right on the surface, which is why, I wanted to write this book, because I was still working out so many emotions from my own teen years. But my book focuses, specifically on the AIDS epidemic and on AIDS activism, particularly the work of ACT UP in New York City. And, I think one thing that's been very apparent from when I wrote this book and from seeing the response is that feeling of the need for a queer community to respond to what's happening in society is so important, and that we are still unfortunately dealing with so many difficult aspects of being queer, but also, beyond being queer, another pandemic. We're dealing with gun violence, we're dealing with racism. And, I think what the queer community modeled in, the 80s and 90s was a way to come together and fight back and create hope, even when the government turned its back on you and families turned their back on you. And I really think that, for me, like one of the driving forces of writing the novel was always the idea that if we study history, we should do it not with the intent of only not repeating the worst of it, but of actually repeating the best of it, of learning from the activists, of learning from the communities that overcame difficulties in a beautiful way. So that's kind of what I hope people turn to the historical aspect of the book for.
It's sadly someone who was born in 1992. I apologize. That is now historical fiction. So, yeah, I connected to the novels in certain ways, but I get that that could happen. So I guess I'm historical now.
Well, but I will say though, as I growing up, especially the years that I was in Canada, like we were all obsessed with the 50s. And like Grease was my favorite movie. We watched Grease nonstop. And even a lot of the pop stars, like Madonna's True Blue album was very inspired by the 50s. And like I realize that the 50s are just as far from my childhood as the 80s and 90s are to these kids. And I think I hope there is an interest in kind of that time span, because it's the era that your parents grew up in. And it's very much like the history is present.